In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I made these tall Adirondack stools. So stay tuned. Since these stools are going to be living outside, I decided to build mine out of cedar. You can build these stools completely from 1x material and then glue 2 1x's together in order to create the thicker stock needed for the legs and the cross braces. However, my local store has 1x cedars, but they also have 2x4 cedars. So I went ahead and grabbed some 2x stock for my stool. And instead of having a whole bunch of hand sanding to do later on, I always choose to run the rough side through my planer before getting started. I'm building this project on behalf of Rockler Woodworking and I'm using a set of plans that they have come up with. They not only provide the step-by-step instructions, but also the templates needed for several of the parts. The first thing I did was start making the components needed for the seat assembly. I traced the seat support template on a piece of 1x cedar, then took it over to the bandsaw and started cutting them out. On the first one, I made sure to cut it out as perfectly as I could to the line. But on the second, I just did a rough cut out in order to take away the bulk of the material so that I could then take it over to the router table and use a flush trim bit to get it exact to the very first one that I cut. Next, I wheeled out my job site saw to the porch and started cutting all of the needed slats for the seat. After the slats were cut to length, I went back to the router table and rounded over all of the edges. And I must say, it's awesome having the option of rolling out the equipment to the porch. After all of the components for the seat were made, I started the assembly process. For this entire build, I'm going to be using Titebond 3 since it is a waterproof glue, and these chairs will be living outside. And I'm placing a dowel in between each one to act as a spacer for these slats. I actually made a mistake when assembling the seats. I thought the plan said to leave an overhang of 3/8 of an inch on either side. So that's what I'm doing here with the spacer. However, I later learned that this is incorrect and the slats should be flush. I end up making it work, but just to let you know, if you end up following the plans, don't do as I do here. After getting all the slats spaced evenly, I came through with a pre-drilled countersink bit and then attached everything with stainless steel screws. If the chairs are going to be living outside, you want to make sure that you're using hardware of an exterior grade. With the seat complete, I moved over to the miter saw stand, grabbed my 2x4 material, and started cutting the legs needed for each stool. Now I have a balcony that wraps around my entire porch, so instead of just making 1 or 2, I decided to make 5 so that I could place them everywhere. With the legs cut to length and also angled at both ends, I took it out to my table saw and ripped the 2x4 in half in order to create both of the legs needed. So then I went back to the miter saw and started cutting the horizontal top brace that will connect the 2 legs and support it. Now this top brace will be connected to the legs by way of a half lap joint. And if you're using 1x material for your build instead of 2x material like me, then you can simply cut 2 pieces of different lengths and then join them together to create 2 rabbets. However, since I am using 2x material, I had to figure out a way to cut this out without using a table saw and dado stack, as my job site saw does not receive a dado. So I went over to the bandsaw and rigged up something to make this cut. I'm not able to just push the material through the blade as it would give me a straight cut. So instead I took a wedge and taped it to the bottom side of my stock. Then for that face angled cut, I was able to tilt the table of my bandsaw and then push through my material. And I was very pleasantly surprised at how nice these rabbets came out. Next, I set them in place on the leg and simply traced the profile onto the leg so that I could repeat the process at the bandsaw and create the corresponding rabbet needed in the leg pieces. The stop that I set up for the previous cut is exactly the same, so it might look complicated, but it's very simple to repeat once you have the setup complete. Again, I'm using Titebond 3 wood glue on all of these joints to protect it from weather. I set the 2 pieces in place, clamp it together so that it won't move around on me, and then counterbore and attach it using 2 screws at each joint. And note that the screws here should be on what will be the inside of the leg, that when the chair is assembled, you won't be able to see them. After getting one leg complete, I then repeated the process for the other, or others. As I'm making 5, it was quite a few pairs. Next, I moved on to making the lower support. It's almost identical to the top support as it will stretch across both legs and connect the 2. So I was able to use my same exact setup over at the bandsaw. So even though it's a lot of parts, this did go pretty quickly once I got into a groove. Instead of making all the cuts needed on one leg and then repeating on the next, I would make the same cut on all the legs before moving on to the next cut, because they all do require something a little different. Either the fence moved differently, or the stop block adjusted, or even the bandsaw tilted to the other side. And you can see that the left is a rabbet handled at the bandsaw, but the right is a dado, which I can't handle at the bandsaw. It'd be easy with the table saw and a dado stack. However, since I don't have that equipment, I placed the stock in my super jaws and used my router instead. It is quite a bit of material, so I took it in 2 passes. And since I have so many parts, to speed it up a little bit, I would place 2 or 3 pieces in my super jaws at the same time. Moving on to making the footrest, this requires a slight curve in the top portion, just for aesthetics. I clamped one of the boards onto my workbench and then attached 2 screws where this curve needed to end. Then used these screws to bend a flexible ruler into the gradual curve. Since I'm making 5, I cut 5 more boards to length and width, and then taped them all together, and then cut them all at once. And before taking off the tape, I flipped my belt sander upside down and refined this curve just a little bit more to my liking. All of the components are now made, so it was time to refine them a little bit before assembling. I rounded over all of the parts at the router table and then also gave everything a nice thorough sanding. For whatever reason, I forgot to plane down the edges of the 2x4 material, so I used this brand new belt sander that Triton's come out with. It's a 4x24 inch belt sander in order to smooth out that rough cedar. The process for assembling the lower portion is to attach a lower back cross member and the footrest to those 2 lower supports. And this is where I compensated for my mistake earlier in the seat design. Since I left the slats overhanging by 3/8 of an inch on each side, I took out 3/4 of an inch in this back cross member as well as this footrest. And what this does is pull in the lower portion of the stool by 3/4 of an inch, which is the exact amount that I left out of the seat. And now you can see how the 2 assemblies start coming together, that lower support assembly with the leg assembly. It is very satisfying to have those rabbet and dado together so perfectly. I applied Titebond 3 to all of the joints and then also used carriage bolts with a washer and a locking nut on it. After getting one side attached, I flipped it over and repeated the process on the other side. Now the seat assembly can be attached to the legs. And again, I'm still having to make modifications for my mistake with the seat design. The seat is supposed to be attached by attaching the seat support to the legs. However, my slats are in the way because I left them overhanging. To fix this, I set it in place and used a pencil to mark the slats that I needed to cut out. All it took was 2 quick little notches and the seat was able to fit very nicely into place. This was an unintentional mistake, but I think I like it. And that is 1 completed stool base, or actually in my case, 5 completed stool bases. Heck, if you're gonna make one, you might as well make a bunch of them, especially with Mother and Father's Day coming up. The bottom assembly being done, let's move on to making the back assembly. After cutting all of the slats to width, I got out my Rockler tapering jig and gave every single one a slight taper. Since I'm making so many of these, as I was cutting up boards, I would assign them to a chair and place them on a chair until they were ready to be assembled. Grabbing all of the back slats, I used a clamp to hold it together and then used my compass here in order to make a slight radius up at the top. The plan actually calls out for something like 21 degrees. I don't know what 21 degrees looks like, so I just made my compass as long as possible and made a very slight and gradual curve. Next, I took it over to the bandsaw and cut it all out. I also cut out all of the lower and upper back supports. This is another part on the chair that comes with the template, so all I had to do is trace it out a few times on the board. Everything on these is cut at a 90 except for that inside curve, which is cut at an angle so that the back slats have a slight tilt to them whenever you're sitting in the chair, making for a more comfortable sit. And I will admit, while it's a lot of work to cut all of the parts needed for 5 chairs, it sure did look cool in my staging area. To get going on the assembly of the backs, I set up a very simple jig and then started arranging the slats on the lower back support, once again using dowels to act as a spacer here. I used a pre-drill with a countersink and then attached everything using screws. With that done, I dry fitted the back into place and then clamped together the arms to the upper back support so that I could also dry fit them into place. By dry fitting them, I could adjust the position of the arms on that upper back support so that I could really hone in their left to right position on that leg assembly. I was going for just a slight overhang on the inside, which left a much larger overhang on the outside. Once I got the position where I liked it, I could then trace the profile of the armrest to that upper back support and then cut it out at the bandsaw. At this point, all of the pieces are made and it was just a matter of rounding things over and doing a little bit of sanding before the final assembly. The arms are attached to the upper back support by way of carriage bolt, washer, and also a locking nut. Then the arm can be attached to the leg assembly, that lower support also attached to the leg assembly, and then finally the slats to the upper back support. Now I have 5 complete Adirondack stools, and I was not the only one anxious to test it out. Good boy. Well, what do you think? I take that as a good answer. These are going to be the perfect height stools for the balcony around the house. They're going to be tall enough to where I can still see over the railing and enjoy the view. Now, if you're interested in building a traditional Adirondack chair, then be sure to check the description down below. I've left you a link to the video I did on those last year. Big thank you to Rockler for supporting my channel and what I do. This was a really fun project, as it was the very first one I got to complete in my brand new shop. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you on whatever it is I'm building next.